So you're here to begin your AP US History review. Let's start our story with Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. But you know what? We might need to go back a little bit earlier than that. What about the civilizations that were already in North America at the time that the Europeans arrived? What happened when the arrival of the Europeans took place? How did their interaction impact both the Europeans and the natives? And then what about the other Europeans that arrived? The British, the French, the Dutch? How do those compare with what the Spanish colonists were doing? Those are some of the questions that we need to look at as we begin our review for the AP US History exam with time periods 1 and 2. I'm Dr. Rhonda Webb, and I am so very glad that you're here. Let's look at what we're going to be investigating in tonight's session. So as we are starting our review, we want to make sure that we are really looking at the content of the AP US History exam, and we're looking at the format, both the digital version and the paper version. We also want to look at some of the essential content, but I want you to be aware, this is a review of the content. We're not teaching the content. That's something that you can watch on the AP Daily videos, but also from your classes that you've already studied this year. We're going to review some of that essential content, and we're really going to plug it into the different exam components. In tonight's session, we're going to really focus on the short answer question and also look at some multiple choice questions as we continue our study. So as we go tonight, if you end up with some comments or some questions that you want to share, please go ahead and use this QR code, and I'll show this to you again at the end, where you can send some questions and some feedback. And then in future sessions, we'll address some of those comments or the questions that you may still have. So the exam format for 2021, you've got the paper version, and this is the traditional exam format. This is exactly how it's been for all of these years, where you've got the multiple choice section first, then the short answer, then you have a nice break, and then the document-based question and the long essay. The digital version this year is very similar, but you'll notice that the difference here is going to be with the long essay question. There won't be a long essay question on the digital format. You'll have a second short answer question set, and we'll be looking at the types of questions that will be used in those very short answer sessions. So that's where we're going to focus our attention tonight. So as we begin to study this, I want you to really think about how the format of the questions are set up. The questions are going to be either causation, comparison, or continuity and change over time. And as you're doing this, College Board is going to ask you to evaluate various topics. And I want to really start to focus in on this, because everything that we're doing, when you're reviewing content, I want you to really think about how are those causes leading up to the American Revolution? What are those causes leading up to the American Revolution? But when you're evaluating causes, you're determining which are the most significant causes. So think about that, and we'll work that in some of our sample questions over the next few sessions. Same thing with comparison. Comparison means both similarity and difference. So you want to make sure that you're working that into your study as well. If you only have differences, well, then identify, this is a difference, this is a difference, and this is a difference, but this is the most significant difference. That gets into evaluation. It's a much higher level answer. Same thing with continuity and change over time. There are some things that are going to change between a certain time period or a range of dates, but then there's also things that are going to remain the same throughout. So if you are crafting your answer, think about including both continuities and changes. But if you only have changes, evaluate those changes. Which is the most significant change that occurs? All right, so let's go ahead and just dive right into time periods 1 and 2 and look at some of the essential content. So as we started out, we were discussing what were the civilizations like that already existed before European contact. And so I have a map here, and this is basically set up by language groups of the native tribes. But we want to consider how the geography of the region impacted the way they lived. So the first group that I want to mention would be the Mississippians, or the Mississippi River Valley indigenous tribes. These would often be, and I just want to kind of talk about some general characteristics that you might want to include here. So these tribes would be what we call the mound builders, and some of them had really, really large communities, like in Cahokia along the Mississippi River. So they're going to be traders, they're going to be farmers, and they're also going to be hunters. Then if we look at the Eastern Woodland, these would be like the Iroquois tribes here in the East, and they're going to be known for a pretty sophisticated system of government. They're going to also have more of the long houses that they're going to be live in, and they're also going to be farmers. Then in the Southwest, this is a pretty unique group, and especially the geography here is important because of the lack of rainfall. They've still got to sustain a population. So many of these tribes, the Anasazi, the Hohokam, they're going to be using irrigation as one of their key features within their civilizations to try to sustain those population groups. Then we've got the Great Lakes region. You might have the Chippewa tribes here. And again, there's going to be a lot of fishing. There's going to be a lot of using the lakes and the boats that they're going to be developing to transfer materials back and forth. Then in the Pacific Northwest, you're going to have groups like the Chinook, and they're also going to be really good sailors and maritime fishermen as well. And then the group in the middle, the Great Plains region, these are going to be the tribes that are most often tied to the buffalo and the bison population. They're going to really adopt the horses that are going to be brought in by the Europeans. So these are all different groups, but again, geography is driving the way that they live and the way that their civilizations are set up. And these are really sophisticated civilizations, but the question becomes, did the Europeans really give them much credit for their level of sophistication? And that's something we want to investigate. One of the other important features here is the cultivation of maize that begins here with the Aztec civilizations in and around what today would be Mexico, but it also is going to spread throughout North America with this maize cultivation that begins to spread into the different areas, and it sustains large levels of population. So another key feature of time period one would be the Columbian Exchange. And so this is looking at different items, the exchange of items that are native to Europe, whether it's the plant or the animal life that are brought to North America, and then vice versa, how the plant animal life from the Americas is sent back to Europe. So if we look at kind of this general list, we've got the items that the Europeans brought to North America, and you can see that you've got a lot of foodstuffs that are brought here that end up growing very well. So the wheat and the soybeans and the sugar and the rice, but then also the horses, and then clearly smallpox is going to be an issue that we'll discuss here in a second. And then you've got the items that are indigenous to the Americas that go back to Europe that definitely impact the population there. So if we're looking at what's brought back, potatoes and the maize that we've already mentioned, those are going to be very high yield crops that will sustain the vastly growing populations of Europe. So those are very important items. The ones that I want you to pay particular attention to, because these will become part of our answers as we begin to practice some SAQs in a minute, will be smallpox and the potatoes and the tobacco. What does smallpox do to the population of natives? That's something to really keep in mind, because as smallpox is brought by the European explorers, the native populations don't have a natural immunity to that disease, and it wipes out huge parts of the population. So even though the natives outnumber the Europeans significantly, smallpox is going to have an impact on their ability to protect their lands from outside conquest. And then the influence of potatoes and tobacco, that's also going to be a huge moneymaker for the Europeans. All right, so as we begin to look at this exploration, we want to think about also the labor systems that are involved. So as we begin to look at Spanish exploration, what allows the Spanish at that time to arrive in the Americas? Well, part of it's new technology. You've got the maritime technology with the caravel and the astrolabe that's allowing the ships to actually make it to the Americas. And then there's also new methods of funding. So you've got some of the joint stock companies that we'll look at with the English colonies. And then the competition. It's a rivalry in Europe. They're trying to outdo one another. It's about power, it's about prestige. And so this was something that was distinguishing and separating the Spanish from the other European nations. And then the other European nations get involved as well. So once they establish those colonies, what about the labor that's involved in the exploration? And so with the Spanish, we're going to definitely see the impact of the population with the influence of smallpox, but we're also going to see the encomienda. So this was an encomienda was basically a grant of land that's given to the conquistadors, and then they're going to be really looking into mining. That's going to be something that the Spanish are definitely interested in, is the tribute, the mining, the gold, the silver that's coming out of those colonies. And the encomienda is a grant of land by the king of Spain to the conquistador to have a tract of land that they are going to be mining, and they're entitled to the native labor that's living in that grant of land. So nobody asked the natives who were living there, but the Spanish are still going to be given that labor. So as the impacts of smallpox and some of the other wars and things that break out, we're going to see a shift into enslaved Africans brought in as well. And so all of this mix of different groups of people is going to lead to, in the Spanish colonies, what's known as the casta system, where you've got a hierarchy of who has more power within the Spanish colonies. There also begins to be questions about the appropriateness of the encomienda and the tying the forced labor of the natives to those lands. And this plays out in a very public manner back in Spain in what's known as the Valladolid debate. And you may have looked at some of these documents in your classes where there was a trial, basically, or a hearing that was held to determine whether or not the natives deserved freedom or whether they should be used as forced labor. And so we have two opposing viewpoints that are brought in here to debate the encomienda and what types of entitlement is tied to that, to the Spanish conquistadors. So if we're always, again, thinking back to what we started with, comparison, continuity and change over time, and causation, we can definitely look at this as an example of comparison. So always thinking about similarities and differences. They have very different opinions on how native labor should be handled, but what they agree on is that there should be some sort of policy set out by the Spanish king in Europe about how this is going to be handled in the Americas. So that would be the similarity. The difference is their perspective on what should happen to the native labor. So Juan Sepulveda believes that the native populations were not capable of governing themselves, and therefore they need Spanish rule. So this may remind you of some topics that you talked about later on in American history, this idea of social Darwinism, where you've got groups that are more suited than others to be able to govern and that kind of thing. So that's where Sepulveda stands on the issue. Bartolome de las Casas has a totally different view, and he believes that there is this idea that natives are free men and that they deserve freedom on their own. And so this idea of Spanish rule and forced labor was unjust. And so this plays out in a very public manner. Now, the outcome of it, both sides claimed victory. Both sides claimed that they had the strongest argument here in the Valladolid debate. But bottom line is, this starts at this very earliest moment, the question of forced labor and the appropriateness of that based on the idea of natural rights. And it starts here with de las Casas and Sepulveda. All right. So as we shift into time period 2, we're going to get a little bit further into the other groups of colonies. And so we're going to see the Spanish colonies that we've already talked about, but then you also have the French and the Dutch that are colonizing as well. So this is a chart that I actually use with my students as we're studying this during time periods 1 and 2, and we begin to make comparisons. So after we've studied it, we go back and we fill in this chart, and then I have them create those comparisons. And again, what does comparison include? It includes similarities and differences. So can you make assertions? Can you come up with claims about similarities and differences based on these ideas. So we've talked about the Spanish, and they end up with the casta system, with their interaction with the natives, and their economic emphasis becomes very much about the mining of the gold and the silver. There is some plantation agriculture, but that's going to be more in the Caribbean region with the sugar. So then when the French come along, they're looking for that Northwest Passage, trying to get back to Asia for trading purposes. But there's also going to be this emphasis on the fur trade. And so they're going to be a little bit different. They're not mining the gold and the silver. It's going to be the fur trade. And you've also got a similarity here where you've got this idea of Catholicism being emphasized. So the Jesuit priests are going to be in New France, or the French colonies, that are going to be looking at the natives that live there and looking at protecting and promoting Catholicism. Same thing with the Spanish colonies. In the Dutch colonies, that's not going to be the case. There's going to be so much diversity here. It's all about trade. The Dutch at the time had cornered the market on transporting goods. They were basically the shippers for all of the other European countries where they're producing different goods and resources. The Dutch were the ones who were transporting it on their ships. So as they set up colonies here in North America, they're also getting involved in the fur trade. But in terms of religion, you have all different types of religions here. So those would be the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. But then the English are going to get involved. And so we further focus in on these English colonies, and we're going to do the same thing. Can you make some claims? Can you make some assertions about what's similar and what's different in the various regions of the English colonies? So those southern colonies, that would include like Virginia and the Carolinas and my home state of Georgia and Maryland. Those would make up those southern colonies, and especially Virginia and Maryland will be the focus early on in the Chesapeake region with the cultivation of tobacco. So the founding purpose here is going to be quite different from those colonies in New England, where we've got the financial gain with the growth of agriculture, plantation agriculture, with when they finally figured out that with John Rolfe that tobacco grows pretty well in the southern colonies. With the exception of Maryland, religion isn't necessarily the priority here. It's about making money. Then you've got the Puritans that come in the New England colonies. So that would be Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth. You probably talked about the Mayflower Compact, one of those founding documents setting up that government in the Plymouth colony. And then the Mid-Atlantic colonies, so this would be more or less Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, that region kind of in the Mid-Atlantic. Those colonies were actually acquired by the Dutch. So they were already, in some cases, especially in the case of New York, already established. It had previously been New Netherland, and New York City would have been New Amsterdam. When the English get control of it, then it becomes New York, named for the Duke of York, who's given the colony as a gift by the English king or the English monarch. So the Mid-Atlantic colonies, again, they're going to still have all that diversity because you've already got the Dutch settlements that are already there that were already diverse. And so when the English take over, that diversity doesn't change. And then you've also got here this impact of the natives. So in the beginning, you've got less violence here in the southern colonies. It's about peaceful trade. That changes as time goes on and the population grows and they encroach on more native lands. Then we begin to see some of those Indian wars. Same thing here in New England. So there are a lot of Indian wars, Metacom's War, King Philip's War, as it was called. And then you've got the praying towns that would be an effort for conversion. So again, you can use a chart like this to really look at similarities and differences. And what I would suggest that you do is plug in what are some important events, who are some important people related to all of these different colonies. So as we transition into labor in the British colonies, we're going to see in the beginning that there are more indentured servants than there are enslaved Africans. And that turning point, that transition, really begins to play out with Bacon's Rebellion. And you may remember that that was a class struggle where you had the indentured servants after they've worked off their 7 years or 5 years of time of labor for their passage to the colonies. They're going to be moving on to lands on the outskirts of town. And so they're looking for help from the government. They don't get it. It becomes quite problematic. And so we begin to see that the Virginians start to turn to more enslaved African labor as they transition. All right, so let's look at, so that's kind of a quick review. Like I said, we reviewed this pretty quick, but if you want more details about that, certainly check out the AP Daily videos. So I want us to transition into some elements of the exam, starting with the multiple choice set of questions. And both the digital and the paper version will have these questions. There's 55 questions in 55 minutes, and they're all stimulus based. And so they're going to be in sets of 3 or 4 questions, all related to some sort of a stimulus. And it's a pretty big chunk of your exam score. Tomorrow, Mr. Pulaski is going to be your host, and he's going to spend a little bit more time talking about your strategies, how you break down the questions related to multiple choice. So let's look at a practice question here. So this is what I'm talking about with the stimulus-based question. And this one deals with the Navigation Acts. And I pulled this question from AP Classroom on purpose because it deals with another really big topic within time period 2, and that's mercantilism. What's the purpose of these English colonies? And the purpose is not for the colonies to grow and become self-supporting and sustaining and thriving. The purpose of the colony is to help the English make money and to profit. And so to do that, you've got this mercantilist system where the colonies are providing the raw materials back to England for them to manufacture and produce finished products. So the Navigation Acts were a series of laws that are going to really restrict the ability of the colonies to emerge as these very profitable places on their own. So let's look at a portion of this. So here you've got the excerpt. Always look at the source information related to the excerpt before you read it. So we've got the English Parliament Navigation Act 1696. So we can already think about mercantilism. So look what it's saying. Be it enacted that after the 5th and the 20th day of March 1698, no goods or merchandise whatsoever shall be imported into or exported out of any colony or plantation to His Majesty in Asia, Africa, or America, and any ship but what is or shall be built of England, Ireland, or the said colony. So bottom line, what this is saying is you can only transport all of those resources on English-built ships. Now, what did I just say about the Dutch colonies? Weren't those Dutch colonies the ones, didn't we talk about the Dutch as being really the main transporters of goods? So this is trying to turn that part of the economy around to where those are only on English ships. So let's look at the question here. The goals presented in the excerpt from the Act have the most in common with which of the following? Now look what they're doing here. They're comparing this to another time period, and that's something you really need to be familiar with in the multiple choice question sets. There's usually going to be at least one of the questions in the set that's going to try to make a comparison. There's that word again, comparison, similarity or difference between whatever the topic is of the question, in this case, the Navigation Acts, and with that of another period. So let's think about what the Navigation Acts are trying to do. Aren't they trying to promote the economic stability and success of England? Yes. So if we begin to compare that with other time periods, increases in the federal tariff in the 1820s. I always tell my students, try to make this into true false. Can I look at this question and say, true false, did the federal tariff in the 1820 compare with the goals of the Navigation Act? So what was the tariff? Well, that's a tax on imported products. And what's the point of a tariff? Well, it's to promote businesses within the United States. That's a possibility. I want to continue looking. So progressive era antitrust reforms in the 1900s. I don't know about that because that's breaking down businesses. And so that probably wouldn't work. Free trade policies in the 1990s, we really don't want free and open trade because this is saying it's restricted only to English ships. And federal tax reductions in the 2000s. I don't know that that's the right answer. So think about how I've reasoned through that. I've made that comparison. I've looked at what was the purpose, and then I've compared it with what I know. So here's the next question, same excerpt. We won't read it again, but look at the question. The excerpt most directly reflects which of the following goals of England's North American colonies. What are we trying to do with the North American colonies? Do we want them to become producers of their own manufactured goods? Absolutely not. That's not what mercantilism is about. Aiding them in developing trade with other European nations? Nope, we've already said they can't do that. It only has to go on an English ship. integrating them into a coherent imperial structure based on mercantilism. There's your answer, because that's our key ticket word, mercantilism in the Navigation Acts. But I want to double check that last option, protecting them from American Indian attacks. Nope, this doesn't have anything to do with American Indians. So there's our answer. All right, then the third one direct long-term effect of the Navigation Act was that it did what? So again, think about those styles of question I told you about: comparison, continuity and change over time, and causation. So isn't a causation question about causes and effects? So this is looking at the effects of those of the Navigation Acts. Did it promote commercial treaties with Spain and France? Nope, I don't think so. Did it contribute to the rise of opposition that ultimately fostered an independence movement? Possibly. So do you think the colonists were happy about having these restrictions? Probably not. So that might be a possibility. Encouraging the colonists to expand trade agreements with the American Indians, that's not going to be the case. Led to the imposition of heavy taxes on the North American colonists in the 1700s. So I don't know that the Navigation Acts are going to be about those taxes. I think it's going to be more about the effect that it has on the colonists wanting to have some independence and to be able, they've got the resources. Why not go ahead and take advantage of it? That's going to be a topic for the next session when you get into Thomas Paine's common sense and his ideas.